Hi everyone, I've got my A2 mixed media paper and this is a little turquoise watercolor marker. This one's by Winsor & Newton. They actually are dual tipped, so you've got a brush tip and a fine liner tip. I often use the brush tip, but today I'm actually going to be using the fine liner just to change things up a bit, and also because I plan to do a drawing in preparation for a painting of a multitude of sheep, so rather a large flock of sheep. And let's get going with that. So I plan on putting the main character about 2/3 of the way in from the left of the paper, and the head of that character, um, above halfway up. So we'll begin to pop that one in around about here. So I'll start off, pretty loose with my drawing and not be overly cautious in terms of getting proportions right. But then what I'll do in a bit, it might not be in this clip, but what I'll do at some point is come back in and tidy things up in terms of getting heads and limbs in the right places if necessary. Sometimes by taking this loose approach, things work out wonderfully the first time, but unfortunately that doesn't always happen. So um, nothing against correcting mistakes. In fact, it's the essence of my work, I would go as far as to say. Um, so we've got the body of the sheep here, head's looking over, twisting round to our left. And then directly below the eye, we've got a leg peeking out there. Fairly slender legs. And there we've got 4 legs in place there. Now, part of the reason that this particular sheep caught my eye was because amongst the flock of several, let me just, now this is a key before I go into why I chose this one as the main character. Let's just make sure I've got things reasonably right here, because this is an occasion where it's going to make my life a bit more difficult to correct things if I don't get this bit right. I don't think I'm too bad on that line. So as I was saying, the reason it appealed to me was there's a little lamb here, almost completely in shadow of the adult, and just sheltering against the flank of the animal. So I was quite drawn to that artistically, because this little lamb is going to be almost completely in silhouette when the painting's complete. And then there's a cast shadow here, which I will just indicate very loosely. Okay, so they're the main spotlight characters, as it were. So the question now is which other animals from the reference to include. And I've got a sheep back here with a rather quizzical look on its face. So we'll put that one in up here. Top of the head is it's off in the distance, but the top of the head of that one's a bit higher up as we're looking at it than the one I just drew. And again, this animal has a lamb standing right next to it, but in this case we get a different view of the situation because the lamb is kind of side on, and no, I don't think I'm quite happy with the adult sheep there, but I don't think I've got the proportions of the lamb set up too well. Oops. Oh, yeah, I don't need to get it exactly right, but I think that's a little better. And then we've actually got another animal in front, so that actually gives me a little opportunity here, because I quite like composing my paintings of animals in a non too what's the word, manufactured way, I guess. So when you're looking at flocks of sheep or herds of cattle and so on, they're not typically all in the same orientation, and they're certainly not arranged as one might choose to fit a particular composition. So they're I like to include some animals which are wandering off of the edge of frame, because I think it has a slightly more natural representation of what happens in the real world. Okay, so something's still not quite right with this guy. I can't quite see what it. I can see what it is, but I'm not quite sure how to fix it. Oh, I see what I've done. So the butt, yeah, okay. Or I see part of what I've done. So the back should be coming along here, and the rear end actually comes all the way out to there, and then he's got his fluffy tail there. Comes down there. The legs of the adult are showing through there, so it still isn't quite right, but I'll be able to fix that when I add paint. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 animals. Let's see if we can select another couple of cast members. So here's another one. We'll put in around about here. And this one's got another cast shadow. I need to go back and check the cast shadows on the others, although there's no particular reason to put that in now, but I may as well. Helps to anchor them to the ground. Okay. So if the back edge of the field is round about here, perhaps, then we'll put a couple of animals off in the distance. Now, normally, I remember being taught years ago that you typically include odd numbers of things in your paintings: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I've obviously got an even number, but I actually don't mind it like that. It's a little bit of an unusual arrangement I've got there, but I've got sort of a triangle there, sort of which sort of brings the eye into the focus there, and then these two help create a sense of depth. And obviously, I'll add some background and stuff. But at the moment, I think I'm going to stick with that composition as it is. So I've got my little kit here, but I'm actually using tube watercolors. I've got some cerulean blue, cad yellow, and undersea green squeezed out onto the lid. I'm going to start with this synthetic mop brush. And this bit of blue here, I think that's acrylic. That's bled in from another painting that I did previously on this pad of paper. But we'll make use of that, and that will become part of the sky. So I'm just going to start out by grabbing some of this cerulean. And I don't want things to be too pure blue, so I'm just going to grab a little bit of raw umber there and mix that in. I probably added a bit too much there, to be honest, so we'll grab a bit more of the blue, just so that it's not, too much of a pastel sky. And we'll come back through. And then I think that's neutral tint that's dried out on the lid. So we'll add a few touches of grey to the sky as well. So these sheep were up on Dartmoor, and if you've ever been to Dartmoor, the weather is very changeable up there, so there's usually at least a couple of clouds in the sky, and a variety of colours. So we've got a little bit of a sky going on there. So let's now mix in. Actually, I'm going to grab some yellow ochre from the pan there, and we'll just put in a distant hill line, or at least begin to hint at it. So with these early stages with the watercolour washes, I like to often work in the way I am, where it's very, wet in wet, and what happens, and then we can always adjust for it once things have dried, if it isn't looking the way that we want. But then as we come down towards the edge of the field, things become a little greener, so we'll pop some of that undersea green that I have there on the lid into that mix. Now, if these watercolour washes bleed into the watercolour marker that I used for the animals, then that's no problem at all. We'll just either keep those random effects or remove them later. Perhaps there's a hedge line there, which will help act as contours on the hills, and then we'll just vary the brushwork as we move over to the left here. And then within those paler colours, there's some darker tree line, so I'm grabbing some more of that undersea green, but this time going to pick up some, if I can activate it, pick up some of the ultramarine blue and a bit of the alizarin that came off the lid there, and that'll probably do well. So I'm not looking to copy the landscape in my reference photo, but just be inspired by it. Okay, so we've introduced some distant landscape there. So now, as we start to tackle the field, I'm going to keep what I've got going on the lid, but I'm mixing in quite a lot of that cad yellow. And we'll run some of that across the back of the field. Mix in some of the cerulean blue. Touch of the undersea green. A little bit more of the undersea green going into the mix. Let's get a bit more water. And I'm going to put down, if I just wash out the brush, I'm going to put down some almost pure cad yellow here in the foreground. And then perhaps we'll mix in a little touch of the yellow ochre into what is left of that cad yellow. We'll put that in there. And then go a little darker with some more of the undersea green. And then just thinking ahead a little bit, I whacked in that undersea green over here, which I actually quite like the colour of. But if you remember in the last live stream, I mentioned that this little guy is almost completely in shadow, so I want to keep the background around him kind of pale. So I'll just pop in, or reasonably pale anyway. So just put in a lighter colour there, which isn't quite as light as I would have liked, but it'll do. So I'm going to let that dry as it is, and some of these washes and things will start to cauliflower or run, and for painting a field in the style I'm going for, that's no problem at all. So I'm going to leave that to dry, and then once completely dry, I'll come back in and start tackling the animals. So I think that's about it for this stage. This paper's pretty good. It doesn't really buckle unless you get it extremely wet. It has buckled a little bit here, but this is Daler-Rowney mixed media paper, and it's pretty good stuff. It's quite a nice way if you're trying to mimic nature. Letting the watercolor create these random patterns is often more effective than if you try and replicate it consciously. So I'm not sure I will keep all of these patterns within the grass or the countryside, but many of them I will. But anyway, what I'm going to do today is work on some of the animals. We'll start with these two background sheep here. So I've switched to my interactive acrylics, and the palette's a bit messy, but I've got tinting white there, cad yellow there, cad red, ultramarine blue, and burnt umber. I'm going to start with a little flat synthetic, which is a little bit frayed. And what we will do is mix up a fairly pale sheep colour. So I need to keep things pale and fairly cool for back here. So tinting white, a little touch of the burnt umber, some of the yellow, and we'll start off with that. And I'm just going to use the corner of the brush. It's a fairly sizable brush. given the tiny size of the animal back here. But that's not bad. That's a fairly cool neutral colour. I haven't worried about covering up the outlines just yet. We'll come to that in a moment possibly. Let's use that same colour for this next sheep. And for the moment, that's probably all I need to do for those two. Now, if you remember from last time, if you happen to see the previous stream, I put in this dark region in the wash and then deliberately lightened the area around this little lamb, because this little lamb's going to be in shadow, so I want high contrast there. But a consequence of that was this could now perhaps be a cast shadow because of some cloud overhead. So I want to keep the treatment of these animals on the edge, much like the animals in the background. I'll keep the treatment, even in the finished painting. That will be quite simple compared to these two main animals here. And I'm thinking, well, if these were kind of more dark and subdued in colour, then that would also keep them, less noticeable than the main characters. So I want people's eye to be drawn to these two, and these over here are less important. So what we'll do is we'll carry on with that, something similar to that colour we've got. I'm going to grab a bit more of the tinting white, touch of the burnt umber, and a touch of the cad yellow. And I'm just going to spray the surface of the painting with a bit of water. Now, because the watercolour is completely dry, unless I scrub at that, I'm not going to have to worry too much about the watercolour lifting off. And I'm just looking at my reference and thinking I might extend the length of the body of that animal there a touch. And at the moment, I quite like this colour that I'm putting down, because these sheep are almost disappearing into the field itself. Now, they'll become more apparent when I add some shadow and highlights, but nevertheless, I still quite like this mid-tone that I'm putting down at the moment. So while we've got that colour on the brush, I think what I'm going to do is just add some more white to that mix. Some more of the tinting white. And again, I'll just spray the surface of those sheep with water, so that when I paint into it, I get some fairly soft edges. So only considering the big shapes at the moment. I'm not worried about texture too much. I'm just squinting at my reference and asking myself, well, where are the lighter areas of these animals? And then, because I'm painting wet in wet, that's going to do some of the work for me in terms of automatically creating textures and soft edges and things. That last brush stroke there was a little bit wayward, but I think we got away with it. So that's all I want to do for those three for the moment. I am going to come back. I don't know whether it will be in this clip or another one, but I will come back and put some shadows in. And here we go. Just trying to find the... Now, I'll keep going. I'm going to move over to this one here. I'm going to keep going with that colour actually, so I'm going to start with a lighter colour than I did with the others. And it's always interesting, I think, when this is the same colour that I just put down as the highlight over there, but you can see it looks like a highlight against the dark background of these, but it looks like a mid-tone putting it against the paler background that this animal is against. So just begin by blocking this one in, and then the hindquarters need to be up a touch higher. So I'm getting a bit of green in the mix because as I move the acrylic or the wet paint over the watercolor marker drawing that I did, that watercolor marker will bleed into the paint, and that's really not a big deal for what I'm doing here. I can cover it up if I don't like the effect I can get, but I mention it because if you do paint yourself, it can be something that gives interesting effects, and you can choose to do quite deliberately. So it's always worth considering how one medium interacts with another, because it can be a really fun way to work, and you can often produce effects that are difficult to achieve any other way. Now, this animal here, I've noticed I made a mistake with my drawing. So the head of the animal needs to be, I may as well block it in with this colour. I'm running out actually. Let's go to the slightly darker one. So the head of this animal needs to be more down there somewhere. So I'm just going to put in a loose mark for the moment, and then we can refine that later. Okay, so having done that, I'm just cleaning my brush off. And again, just want to spray the surface of the painting where I painted that last sheep with a bit of water, and I'm just picking up pure, got a little bit too much water on my brush I think, but we'll see if it works. So I'm just picking up pure tinting white. Now it's not looking like pure white because firstly the paint's so fluid and I'm painting on top of what is a mid-tone, but as mentioned previously, that wet in wet's going to give me some nice fleece-like textures, and also that translucency of the white I'm putting down now, that's going to add a lot of depth and extra dimension to my highlights. So what I will probably do later in the painting is come in with some titanium white, which is much more opaque than this tinting white that I'm currently using, and that will allow me to have sort of extra bright highlights on top of these more subdued ones. Okay, so let's move on to the main two. I'm going to take a different approach with those two, in part because I've more or less run out of tinting white on my palette, and I don't want to, I don't want the live stream to be about me going across the room to get some more paint. So we'll do what we can with these other two, and then come back and maybe put some shadows in on those. We'll see how we get on. Okay, so what I'm going to do to begin with is grab some, we'll take a different approach, we'll work dark to light. So I'm going to grab some of the burnt umber and some of the ultramarine blue. And that doesn't give me a black, but it does give me a very dark tone. So we'll begin by applying some of that to this little lamb. Now it's important to be observant when you're applying very dark shadows like this, because although this little lamb is in very deep shadow, it isn't completely one tone. So for example, his head is much darker as are his legs, than the rest of them. And then when you come down to the fleece, there's a lot more blue in the shadow. So I'm just picking up some more ultramarine. I'm mixing that in with what I've got left on my brush. Now that may well be too dark, but nevertheless it's still going to act, I think that probably is a bit too dark, but it's still going to put in a subtle boundary between the bottom of the head and the legs and the body. But what I can do now is, just in a very unsophisticated way, I'll just grab a bit of the tinting white I've got left. Excuse me, a bit of the tinting white I've got left. I'll just mix that in with what paint is left on my brush, and we can begin to put in a little bit of a subdued highlight there. And I'm just pondering whether I can use this mix towards a cast shadow color, as we've got it on the brush. I think we probably can. So we'll pick up just a touch of cad yellow, mix that into the color that I just used, and that's going to be a very deep green. Some might say blue. Let's put a bit more yellow in there. And I don't know how well that's showing up on camera, but that is a very deep green. And notice that the way I'm painting this, I'm moving my frayed flat brush in more or less vertical strokes, because that's automatically creating a grass-like frayed edge along the top of this shadow. So it just saves you a bit of work if you can think about how to use the brush in the most efficient way. Okay, so we've got that little dude or dudette. Sheltering there behind the adult. So I just wipe my brush off, and again, while I've got this colour on the brush, I'm going to take a bit of that, what little tinting white we've got left, and mix that in with that same deep green. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that as a shadow colour on the underside of the adult. And the reason for that is a fairly bright day when I took my reference photo, and a lot of the shadows are tinted green. The shadows on the on the underside of the adult animal here, because the light's reflecting up off of the grass onto the near white colour of the sheep. So the head is casting a similarly coloured animal down the body, and I think I'm going to more or less leave things like that for today. So so things are starting to resolve a little bit more now. So these two are very simply treated. I'll probably add just a little more in terms of shadow to those eventually, so that they look a bit more 3D. I'm happy with the subdued tone I've got going on here. I will add some shadows and perhaps some highlights. My thinking at the moment is to keep the two lambs in very subdued lighting. Same with the sheep here, but maybe have the head kind of in a little bit more in a bit more bright light. This one will continue and be in bright light with the correction to the head, but won't be in as much detail in the finished painting as these two, which will be in the strongest light and the most resolved. Yes, so I'm kind of running out of the paint I need on my palette, so I need to have a little think and refresh my palette, possibly even clean my palette. We'll see how that goes. I've got my interactive acrylics, so I've got tinting white, burnt umber, cad red, ultramarine blue, and cad yellow. So let's begin by mixing up a reasonable mid-tone for the fleece of this animal. So I'm going to start with some cad yellow. We'll grab a healthy amount of the tinting white, then just the tiniest touch of the cad red, a little bit more of that, just the tiniest touch of the ultramarine blue, a little more on the red, touch of the burnt umber, and on the palette that's still looking a bit yellowy, but I think it might not be too far off for a starting point anyway for the fleece. So I'm just going to spray the surface of the painting with water, and we'll start to put this colour down. Now, last time I put in some greyish shadows, and those will show through. And that's absolutely fine. That's not a problem at all. Okay, so that's a reasonable starting place. But what I want to do next is add a little bit more red to the front of the animal. So I've probably added way too much there, which is a bit of a habit of mine with red. Cat red seems to be remarkably strong. If I end up grabbing just a little bit too much, then it really does affect the colour. A little bit of burnt umber going in, but that might not be too bad a colour. We'll see what happens. Let's keep the surface of the painting just lightly damp. Oh, that's working okay. So what I'm doing now, I wasn't so worried about it for that first layer of paint, but for this second layer, I am looking at my reference photo and following the way the wool falls across the body of the animal. And I'm using my little flat synthetic brush, and this is the frayed, kind of beaten up one that I've been using for many a year. And I still use it because it gives me nice frayed edges. So that's the thinking there. Okay, so far fairly content. Now I'm going to change the colour next. So we'll grab some ultramarine blue, touch of the cad red, good amount of the tinting white, bit of the burnt umber, perhaps a little bit more. And we'll see what this looks like when it goes down. But as we move along the underbelly, I mean, it's kind of working already a little bit because the grey that I put down the other day is showing through. But the shadows change from being kind of reddish in colour to more towards the purple. And that's not too bad. I'm going to darken a little bit of that shadow that I put in the other day. So it's quite important to look within the dark tones and shadows when you're painting to find the range of colours you've got hidden in there. And the same with highlights as well. Very rare that things are just one simple colour. I'm going to grab a bit of the tinting white and mix that in with what I've got left on my brush. And as I come round the left-hand edge of the silhouette, pop some of that there. Now, while I've got that colour on my brush, I'm just cleaning that little brush and switching to, I just chucked that other brush into the water actually. So I'm just switching to this rather neater small flat brush. And I'm going to go back to that dark colour that I had before. Perhaps add a touch of the blue in there and a touch of the burnt umber as well. And that'll make a fairly decent shadow colour, I think, for the top of this leg. The top of that one. And the top of that one as well. So just cleaning off that first brush. Surface of the paper, or the painting rather, is still fairly wet. So what I will do next is grab some of the tinting white and we'll lay some of that over the top of what we've got there already. Now the colour of the fleece in that region isn't quite right, but for the moment I'm content to just sort of work a little more tonally. And just need to grab a bit more of the white. Because what I'm about to do is continue with some of that white on top of other areas in the fleece, and because I'm using the tinting white, this is quite a transparent white even once it's dried, so I'm not, or I hope I'm not, obliterating anything that I've done already. And a lot of what I'm putting down now, the underlayers of paint will show through. Just, it's a nice way to introduce some very soft and subtle highlights. Okay, so next then we can keep going with that white. Managed to get a bit of yellow on the brush somehow. I'm going to mix that in with the paler of the purpley shadows that I had already. And we'll fill in the head of the sheep. With that colour. And that same colour, switching back to the neater brush now. Just need to clean that out a bit. So that same colour, perhaps we'll grab a bit of that. If we put a touch of the blue in there, I think that will work fairly well. For the legs as I move my way down. I think the shadows are a little closer to being a pure blue actually, but that's okay. I think it's going to be all right, and I can always come back and adjust things if I need to. So next what we'll do is grab yet more of our favourite tinting white, a touch of the ultramarine blue, mix those two together, and I will now, I've done this for two reasons. One, I'm about to pop some in here for some slightly lighter shadows. And then two, I'm going to use that to change the colour of that mid-tone that I've put down. And then keeping the same paint on the brush, but I'm just dip the brush into the tinting white. I'm going to come back and use that to add a few brighter areas. That was a bit of a wayward mark, that one, so we'll lift that one off to our sheep head. And I think I may as well keep going with that. Actually, I quite like the coherence of the colour scheme I've got going at the moment. Okay, sticking with that that brush, that neat brush, going to go back to my burnt umber, and I've got this kind of reddish purple mixed in, and that there's that slightly paler orangey brown there. So I've mixed those two together, and that I'm hoping will be a reasonable colour for the regions of darker pigment. On the sheep's head. Could probably do with being a bit darker, to be honest, but I kind of look at a painting in two ways. You know, I'm looking at it in terms of how does it compare to the reference, but I'm also looking at it in terms of how's it working as a painting as a whole. So at the moment, I'm fairly happy with that for the colour scheme. Now, while I've got that colour on the brush, I'm going to go back in and mix that in with a little more of the purple that I had, and going to move away from these two. You can just, let me just check, you can see, yes, you can see those three on the right. So those are my shadowy sheep, if you remember from a previous stream. So what I'm going to do is not worry about detail, but use this new version of the colour I've just mixed up to start to introduce a few shadows and things over here. And you notice I sprayed the surface of the painting with water again in this region. So when I'm looking at this sheep and the two lambs that are standing in front of it, I'm just looking at it as a series of big shapes. Where are the big darks? Where are the large lights? So we're not worrying about the highlights or anything too much. And then I'm going to use that same colour to introduce cast shadows underneath these animals. So if you remember from the previous stream, or one of the previous streams, my plan is these two will be the stars of the show. These three are more or less background players, as is this one here. And I think, I like the way that's working at the moment. So I'm going to go over to this one and just trying to find where that animal is in the reference. Here we go. And we'll keep going with that colour and use that as a shadow colour for this one as well. Now, I seem to remember I noticed a mistake I'd made in my initial drawing before in terms of the positioning of the head. So I just need to make sure I go with my corrected smudge as opposed to the original line work. So I'm just looking fairly carefully to try and ensure I get that in the right spot. I don't think that's too bad. Now, obviously, there needs to be quite a bit of refinement to this animal, but for the moment, that will be okay. Sticking with that same colour, so deviating from reality quite a lot because the shadows aren't this colour. But in terms of working things up to the next stage, I'm fairly content with how that's gone. I particularly like the way the treatment of this animal has gone. I like the colour scheme here, and then keeping that matching with the colour scheme on this one. I've deliberately not touched those two because they're meant to be off in the distance, so I may well do a little bit later, but for now I think I'm going to leave that one there, let everything dry. I'm pretty happy with the way the paint has dried, so when you use the interactive acrylics and you paint onto a wet surface, sometimes it leaves drying marks, which have happened here, and that works quite well for the fleece. And yeah, we'll get going. So I've got my burnt umber, cad red, ultramarine blue, cad yellow left over from yesterday. Added a load more tinting white. So I'm going to begin by using this little flat frayed brush, pick up a load of the tinting white, and I am going to add just a touch of the burnt umber to that. Just a touch of the blue. And we'll see how that goes down on the painting. I'm going to spray the surface of the painting with water. That's perhaps a little darker than, yeah, that's a little too dark, I think. So what I'll do is just lift that off, or lift most of it off anyway. And I'll wipe off my brush and go back in on the tinting white and just pick up a little lick of that paler stuff. And we'll see how this goes down. Now, let's start over here this time. That's a bit more like it. So although this is looking quite opaque, as I put it down on the paper, when it dries it should become a little more transparent. Now I've got the shape of the head of the sheep here a little bit wrong. It's a little bit too long, so I'll take the opportunity while I'm using this white to just trim the nose section a little bit. I'm going to come back in a minute and work on the head. Anyway, so that should work out okay. Got the tail down here. And then the front of the body is in a bit more shadow, but there are highlights within it, so we'll introduce some of those. So I'm just squinting at my reference to try and pick out the biggest shapes, and there is kind of a frill of the fleece, I guess, which is more or less making that kind of shape on the chest of the animal. And then below that, there's another one there. So it's kind of difficult to know how well this is working at this stage because I need to let everything dry completely. But for the moment, I'm fairly happy with the way that's gone down. Now, while I've got this colour on the brush, if you remember a couple of episodes ago, I said I was going to keep these three animals fairly subdued, but I would pop a couple of highlights onto the adult. So I'm going to do that now, just add a little bit of light onto the head of that animal. Perhaps just knock back a bit the top of that. And we'll add a touch on the top of that ear. Then a little bit along the back. And for now, I'm going to leave that one as is. And then, again, continuing with this same colour, we'll come back over to this one on the left. Need to get a bit more paint on the go here. It's a little bright, that last bit I put down, but I will subdue that at some point in the future. So we'll just add a little more of this highlight here. And that's probably enough of that for now. But what I can do is now switch to my other brush. Same one as I used yesterday, the synthetic flat. I've just got paint all over my hand. 1 second. So this synthetic flat, which isn't frayed, and we will come back in and add so I'm still working up the tinting white. I'll grab just a touch of the blue, perhaps a bit more of the white in there, and we'll use this to put down some brighter highlights. Oh, that's still a bit dark, isn't it? So let's get some more tinting white. And while I've got that near pure white on the brush, what I can also do is just add a few smaller marks. Within the fleece. But let's move back to the head now. Brighten up that cheek, the little flash of white on the top of the head, down the side there. That's probably all I need to do for that bit. So the next thing I want to address then is to start to add in some much darker darks, and in order to do that I'm going to stick with this same brush initially, just cleaning that out. And to begin with, what I'll do is I'm just going to grab some of the pure ultramarine blue, just get a touch of water in the mix, and then looking at this leg, just going to add a little blue line of shadow down there. And there on the left of that foot. I think I'll even put one over here as well, just to define the angle of that foot a little better. And then we'll come in here, do something similar. And while I've got that colour on the brush, we'll add a little defining line there for that ear, which I think I've probably put in slightly the wrong place, so we'll just move it. Then come in and define the jawline a little more precisely than I had done. And although I'm using for the most part this flat brush end on, so I'm obviously putting down a straight line effectively, it's surprising how much of a curve you can approximate using a variety of angles of straight line. So that's just kind of refined the shape of the head a little bit there, which was needed. And now I'm just looking around that same animal to see where I could use this blue with perhaps a bit of artistic license, but I think I'm going to leave that one for the moment and go back over to that one on the left and do a little bit of a similar treatment just to refine the shape of this head, because if you remember on my initial drawing I realized that I'd put the head in the wrong spot, and then my initial correction to that was little more than a smudge of paint. So I haven't ever really drawn the head of this animal, so I just want to define it so that it's really good to be loose, I think, when one is painting away, but that can go too far. Because we want to I want this thing to look like a sheep, basically. So that started to help a little bit, I think. So I'm just dry brushing a little bit of this blue over the pale brown shadow that I had before. And I'm also going to take the opportunity with this same colour to put in the front legs. Bit more of the dried brush and along the belly. That's all I'm going to do on that one for the moment. So, having done all of that, let's now go back to the star of the show, and I'm going to take that ultramarine blue and I picked up a bit of white by mistake, but just put a bit of burnt umber in there. Perhaps we'll get a little bit of the red. So that's given me a dark brown. And then this I can use as one of my dark shadow colours. And what I can do here is put in little solid blocks of shadow where you've perhaps got deep cast shadows, and then in addition I can just feather the tips of the brush over the surface of the painting to get a lighter touch. And what I'm able to do by doing this, you see on the legs, for example, I've used about 5 colours now, but by just building it up carefully in stages, it starts to piece together what is hopefully the overall effect of there being a sheep's leg there. Now, underneath the cheek and jaw of this animal, the shadow that I've got there goes a little darker, and it kind of becomes paler as it works its way down the body. And this colour is also, I think, going to be quite handy for the colour on the top of the head, which is a bit darker than what I've got at the moment. So now, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to, we'll give it a go, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to put the mouth in with the corner of this brush. It's not too bad. It's not quite what I had in mind, but I think it needs to come up there a touch more. But we might come back to that at a later date. So with that same colour still. May as well keep it going. But what I am going to do is just add a touch of the tinting white to that same mix. And what we'll do is we'll use that to put in a few little textural lines. To start to pick out some of those little shadows that, you know, the fleece naturally creates as the little clumps of wool lie on top of each other. Now I'm going to add a little more of the cad red to that colour. Yeah, that's not too bad. So there's a shadow which comes down here. Then I'm just cleaning my brush off one more time. And I'm going to grab some of the ultramarine blue, mix that in with the kind of slightly off-white that I had before. Because I think the cheek of that animal on this side could do with being a little more bluish. I'll actually continue that down to there. Equally, have a little bit of that down there on that front leg. So we're starting to get somewhere now. That front sheet is starting to come to life. What I'm going to do is just grab some of the pure tinting white. And I quite like how with this one, a few streams ago, I put down some thicker layers of this and it's dried in little impasto ridges. And it's a nice way to create some fleece-like texture. So I'm just going to do something similar on this animal. Again, much like the other regions of tinting white I've put down, when it dries back, I'm hoping it'll be somewhat translucent. And then towards, at some point later on in the painting, I will come in with titanium white to put down some more opaque highlights. And then on the front of the chest, let's add a little bit of the cad yellow to that. Mix it in with the white, and I just want the tiniest amount of the red. My hope is that this will that's okay. It's nothing too dramatic, but I want to increase the sense of light and brighten up the colours around these two main animals. So I'm going to start with some watercolour. I've got some, I don't know if you can see that, some Viridian there. I've got some, I think this is pronounced perylene green. I think that's correct. I've also got some Hooker's Green as well, all ready to go on my little watercolor palette here. So if you've seen the recent streams, you'll know that I did the background in watercolor, but the animals have been painted in interactive acrylic. So I'm going back to the watercolor for the moment. Let's grab, I think this one's the Hooker's Green. Yeah, that's probably close to what I want, although I've mixed up a bit too strong there. We'll see what that looks like on the paper. Oh, that's okay, I think. So I want to, keep these animals distant. These are under a cloud or under the shadow of a cloud. This one's going to be resolved less, as mentioned a few times now in various episodes. But I want these two in the foreground to really be the center piece of the show. So I want them with brighter colors and to be surrounded by grass which looks a little more lush than what I've got going on at the moment. And one of the things I may do if this doesn't quite work out as planned is come in on top of this with some acrylic, and in particular the fluorescent acrylics. They seem to produce really good colours which match very closely the colours of nature. So I definitely like that already. I think that's brightened things up quite a lot. Let's put some more in back here. Now for the stuff underneath the animal, and just here as well, I want to soften that edge. I'm just keeping it very dilute because I want the colour, but I want to keep it pale to enhance the kind of dark shadows. But I'm going to come back and address this lamb at some point as well, because that's looking a bit too sinister and dark for what I want. So let's get a bit more in here, and perhaps just break up some of that line work I've put in a little bit. But already I think that's making things look quite a lot more lush, which was the hope. So that's a good first step. Let's continue. I just need to wash this brush out. So my next move is I want to subdue some of these watercolor marker lines. In particular, the way things have worked out, it almost looks like there's a continuous line which follows around the back of the sheep and then joins on with the horizon line. So I want to kind of just lose that effect. Back to my interactive acrylics, frayed flat brush. Little bit of tinting white and burnt umber. So just a very pale tertiary colour. And let's just put a little bit of that back here. It's not too bad, but I'm going to add a bit more white to the mix. And then I'll leave a bit, this bit's kind of blended in with the watercolour wash, so that's okay. Put a bit over there and just soften that a little bit. And I can come in later and do a more precise job if I need to, but for now, just want to hide that a bit more. Let's put the paint on a bit more thickly with the ends of the bristles. So that started to work because by putting one colour here where the blue line's showing through quite a lot, not touching it there, and then putting the thicker paint on here with a different colour, it's just started to break up that line, which was the whole point. So let's add a bit of this same colour to the top of this sheep. to lose that background, because I'll come over the top of that with a highlight colour at some point as well. I'm going to leave a little bit of the blue line there and then come in and put a little bit of thicker paint on top there. Let's get a bit of pure white, because when it dries, some of that blue will show through anyway. And I want to lose that bit there as well, I think. So that's helped quite a bit. I think it's, you know, it's still evidence of the line there, which I don't personally mind, but it's started to remove some of that, you know, I've cut this shape out kind of look that I had going on there inadvertently. Now, let's do something similar for, keep going with this same colour. To hide a little more of the line work on these background characters. Because I can always come back in, be a bit more precise later. Okay, that started to soften those up a bit as well, so that's worked out okay. So the next thing I want to do is go back to the foreground animals and introduce some brighter colours to the fleece of this one. And then at the moment, this is very much just a kind of dark and dreary silhouette, this lamb. And I want to introduce a little bit of, you know, subdued colour, some subdued colours in there as well. So let's start with the fleece of the adult. So I'm going to grab some of my cad yellow. And just a little corner of that cad red. Touch more. Maybe just a little bit more. So we've got a kind of yellowy orange. We'll see what that looks like when we put it down on the fleece. Now I'm going over that rather deep shadow I've got there because that didn't come out quite the colour I wanted. So by putting down the thin layer of paint, it will hopefully get a little bit more towards the colour that I want. But I quite like the way this is looking on the front of the animal. It's bringing a sort of much more of a sense of warmth to the light than what I had before. I'm going to add just a little more of the red. I've got to go a little bit careful with this because let's see what that looks like. Oh, that hasn't made as much difference as I thought it would. But it's okay though, it's okay on the whole, so we'll keep going. Yeah, quite happy with that so far. Just going to give my brush a quick clean. And now I want to go, I could do with some cerulean blue really, but I've only got ultramarine here on the palette, but we'll see if we can make it work. So ultramarine blue and a bit of the white, and then we'll grab a touch of that red again. Yeah, that's not too bad. So by keeping the paint thin, my hope is, and it seems to be working out okay, some of the work that I've put down already is going to show through once this paint is dried. And that, I think, is a really nice way to work when you're trying to depict wool and things, because it's such a tangled mess. Or even if it's not tangled, there's so much going on there that there's no way, at least not with the way I paint, no way to paint every little bit of the fleece. So by taking a layered approach, I think it's a good way to summarize what's going on, and it kind of conveys the sense that you've got all these tangles and things without having to depict all of them. So that's worked out okay. So I'm going to add a bit more white to that colour. And I'm going to use that around here. Make the tail a bit fluffier than it was. What little bit is showing of that. Just feather some of that colour across the body. So we can take a couple of approaches when painting a fleece. So in a previous stream, I put down some kind of almost impasto brush strokes of pure white. So they give me some textured highlights. And then by next to those, feathering the tips of the brush with some soft shadow colours or pale shadow colours. That's a nice way to create texture as well. So let's put some of that highlight colour around here. Now in my reference, this area of the fleece is really quite light, but for the moment I'm going to, because I want to change the shape of what I've got there, I'm going to come around and fill that region in a bit more with this same colour, and then I'll add highlights to that later on. Use that to soften some of those dark shadow marks that I put in the other day. And that's not too bad. Okay, so now we'll stick with that colour, but we'll add a touch of yellow to it to bring it towards a green. Perhaps a little bit more. So I've got kind of a bluish green there. And yeah, that's not too bad. So put that there. So some of the light's being reflected off the grass onto the fleece here. And yeah, I'm fairly happy with that at the moment, so that's okay. Next thing then is just going to clean this brush. Actually, do I want to do that? Let's not do that just yet. Let's. I did clean it, but we'll pick up a little bit of that paint. And what I'm going to do is start to lift the tone of this little lamb a little bit. So I put some of that same colour in there. Okay. And while we're there, I have just cleaned the brush. I'm just going to pick up a little bit of the white I've got left. Pick up some of that pale green that I just used, and I'm going to put a little bit of that on the cheek. Perhaps a bit there over the top of the eye. Okay, so that started to bring that a bit more to life, I feel. So let's now move our way back over to the lamb. So I need to grab just a touch more of the white. Just give me a second. And got my white now, so we'll mix up some of the white over here. We'll grab a touch of the burnt umber, a bit more, and that'll do for the moment. So let's no, I'm way too light, so we'll grab some more of the burnt umber. So I need my colours on this lamb in shadow to be lighter than they were, but not too far off in tone, and certainly much darker than the sheep on the left. That's a bit more like it. So, and in fact, that little highlight colour I put on the right side there is perhaps a little too bright, but we'll leave it as it is for the moment. But let's obscure most of it, change most of that deep blue shadow to more of a brown, but keep this left side where the animal is up against the adult as it is. And then I'm just going to change the shape of the head there a touch with that same colour, and maybe the shape of the ear as well. That kind of got lost. That's a little more like it, I think. I probably need to let it dry to be sure. But in doing what I just did, I kind of lost the where the legs join the body a little bit. So just cleaning the brush off again. And what we'll do is come back in with the burnt umber, a bit of the ultramarine blue, and just extend the legs up here a little more. Give a frayed edge to the silhouette on the left. And then there's a rear leg coming down there as well. Let's put a frayed edge over here. Now it's going to be difficult to tell how well that's working tonally until it's fully dry, but it's better than it was, certainly, I feel. And I will add some subdued reflected colours on this right hand edge at some point as well. All right, so now I think we will switch back to the watercolour for a moment. So I'm just washing this brush out thoroughly because I'm going to use it again with the watercolour. And what we'll do is grab some more. I think I'm more or less out of the Hooker's green, so let's try one of these other greens. That one's pretty dark, so that's not really what I want, but let's see if we can use it somewhere as we've got it on the brush. So this shadow, this wasn't where I was going to go, but we may as well do it, isn't quite what I had in mind in terms of colour. I just put down a bit of tone before, so now I've got the wrong green, I may as well make use of it, and that's quite a nice green actually. So the frayed brush is great for very efficiently putting down grass-like texture. It's also super for not so. This kind of mark I'm making here is not so kind of fleece-like, but if you're painting a cow with kind of a shaggy coat, something like that, then perhaps a Highland cow. That's a nice little technique as well. So that shadow's looking a bit more like it in terms of the direction we want to go, and then to keep our colour scheme fairly coherent from one part of the painting to the next, I'll add some of that. I've already got some dark colours down here, but I may as well go over the top of this shadowy grass area here, because that's going to add a little extra dimension to my shadows. So adding a variety of darks within one region really helps. So just cleaning the brush again. So I haven't squeezed out. I've probably got some tube watercolor. In fact, I know I have of a yellow, but let's see. Yeah, I'll perhaps grab the tube. Just give me a second. It's right here. So this one is Naples yellow. So back in just a sec, just popping some of that onto the palette. Okay. Now I've just noticed while I've stepped away from the canvas a bit, I've got some nice cauliflowers going along here, so I can maybe make use of those a bit later on in the process. But just mixing up some of that pale yellow. And we'll lay in some highlighted blades of grass over the top of the shadows. And while I've got that on the go, put some over here as well. And then as I've got that paint on the palette, I may as well just keep going with that. And I pointed out those cauliflowers, so I can kind of, I don't mind them there at all, actually. I kind of like them, but we'll just add we'll break them up a bit with some of that lighter colour, and then come back in with the darker green. And it's a good idea just to kind of play a bit when you do this sort of thing, because, you know, again, grass is how many blades of grass would there be in a field this size? You know, millions upon millions. And they've been trampled on and blown by the wind, and originally growing at weird angles as well. So don't want to get too tied up in having just one direction of brush stroke. You know, scumble around a bit and just see what works. And if you don't like what you get, obviously you can always change it. But actually, I'm quite liking the effects I'm getting here, because what I've got are sort of 2 or 3 layers of randomness. So the original washes were put down very quickly, big broad strokes, and then I allowed the colours to mingle and work their way around the paper as they dried. So I've got a lot of different layering effects and cauliflowers and textures and things. And now that this additional layer of texture on top, once it dries back, I think it's starting to look a bit more field-like, so that's kind of nice. Okay, so let's pop the watercolors back down, and then I'm going to go back to the adult sheep over on the left and put some, just a little bit more in terms of structure into that animal without going into a massive detail. So the first thing I'm going to do is just fill in this region here on the nose. So a bit of the tinting white, touch of the ultramarine blue. We'll pick up just a little bit of that pale burnt umber that I used on that shadow lamb earlier. And let's fill in that bit of the nose. Now that was a bit darker than I intended, but what I'll do is I'll work my way around the animal because it's quite a nice mid-shadow tone. That brush mark was not at all the shape I intended it to be. So let's see if we can just tease that into something a bit more or a bit closer to what I wanted. There we go. So quite like this color actually. I think it's that went on way too heavy there. That wasn't intentional. Okay, let's use a bit of a lighter touch as we work our way around the animal and block in some shadow. So this has started to solidify this animal. So it's looking a bit more modelled, a bit more 3D, and a little less like a drawing. So just cleaning the brush off. So I'm going to come back in with the pure tinting white and just add a few textured highlights across the top of the animal. And again, even here you see where I'm putting down random marks by just tapping the brush on the painting. I think it's a good idea to break that up a bit. So I've got texture, 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 but here I can do a long conventional brush stroke, if you like, to help convey the curvature of the hindquarters there. I'll break up that lump there a touch. So that's not too bad. But what I do want to add are some slightly warmer tones to the underbelly, and I'll also. But before I do that, I'm just going to remember I said that bit was too dark. Okay, now it's too light. But there we go. That's a bit closer to what I want. So it's a little more in line with the reality of the situation. So again, just cleaning the brush off. And yes, I need to kind of create a yellow ochreish brown. So let's come back in with some of my cad yellow. We'll pick up a touch of our cadmium red, mix up a reddish orange, and then a touch of the ultramarine blue, maybe even a touch of the burnt umber, a bit more water, and we'll see what that looks like when it goes down onto the sheep. Oh, that's not too far out from what I wanted, so that's cool. So that's worked fairly well. Let's grab, put in some deeper shadows. So we'll go cad red, add some ultramarine. Let's add a lot more ultramarine blue. So I've got a deep purple there, but I'm going to mix that in with that yellow ochreish colour that I had. Oh, I've got way too much red on my brush. Didn't realise that. That's not too bad, but I just need a bit more blue in there, I think. Let's try that. It's a little more on the red side than I'd planned, but I don't actually mind the way that's looking. That's okay. Again, we'll see what it looks like when it dries back. I'm just pondering, while I've got that on the brush, can I use that anywhere on this main animal? I think I can. I think I can put a bit more of that colour there, shadow under the tail. Perhaps make a bit of shadow under the jawline, a bit darker there. Then I can use some of that over here as well on this little guy. And then I kind of feel I need to elongate this leg. It seems to have got a bit shorter than it should be in the drawing. Now, if I do that, that's effectively got a problem with the shadow. So we'll have to address the shadow later, because I think I do want to. I think those legs are looking a little bit too short. I may be able to get away with that shadow. So I'm just going to wipe off this brush and leave that as it is, and I just need to find myself a smaller flat brush, which I thought I had put out ready, but apparently not. So what we'll do instead, we'll switch to this little liner brush, and that should work for what we want. So what we'll do for now is grab a bit of the tinting white, mix that in with that kind of pale off blue that I had before, but it could perhaps do with having a bit more of the white in there, possibly a lot more. And let's use that to tidy up some of this. So just put a little bit of a line in there. Top of the leg, which is actually in more shadow than I've got it, but really what I'm doing at the moment is just kind of redrawing things a bit, so I don't need to worry about the lighting too much. So that leg is going to come down to there a little more, and then the rear legs aren't as bad. The problem's not as serious, but whoops. So there, anchor the leg to the ground a bit more there. Then that one. It's going to come down there. So that, in my opinion, has made things look a little more anatomically correct. And in fact, what I'm going to do is just stretch that one down there as well. So I personally feel that this little these adjustments that I've made so far have started to bring things to life. I like the brighter colours I've got here. I really like how the colours here are now bouncing off of the colours in the foreground, on the foreground animal. The grass seems to be working well, and the modifications here have pushed these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 very much into the background, kind of out of focus, which was always the intention. My palette today consists of Atelier Interactive Acrylics. As before, Cad Yellow, Ultramarine Blue, Cad Red, Burnt Umber, but this is titanium white now. I've been using tinting white for the most part before, and the titanium white is the more opaque of those two whites. So this is going to create some highlights for me. So I'm just loading that onto a little 1/4 inch wide flat synthetic brush, and I'm going to begin by putting down some little highlights on the head of this sheep. So my hope is that most of the hard work has been done in this painting, because I've done the drawing, I've blocked in everything, included some textures and things. And so I'm hoping that by adding a variety of highlights in different colors and different areas of the painting, it's just going to bring a real sense of light and a little bit more drama to these main two animals. And if you remember from the previous streams, the idea is that the others are going to be deliberately left somewhat less resolved, so that the focus is where we are at the moment. Now, when I add highlights to my paintings, I don't make them all pure white, so I will be adding some little bits of color to these highlights that I'm putting down, partly because that's the way things are in real life, but also it adds a little extra dimension to the painting if you vary things a bit. And but the reason I'm going in with the pure white now is just for simplicity's sake. Obviously, I can just take this color straight out of the tube, or this paint straight out of the tube, and then I can add some more colors to this in a moment. Okay, so reasonably happy with that so far. So I'm just going to grab a touch of ultramarine blue and mix that into the paint. Now, previously I've been diluting my paint with quite a bit of water, but I'm using this at the moment straight out of the tube, because obviously that gives me a thicker and more opaque patch of color. So I just added a touch more blue there. Now I'm being fairly considered when I put these little marks down, because what I don't want to do is have a repetition of the same shape over and over throughout the painting. And I can also just lightly drag the brush over the somewhat textured layers of paint that I've already put down. Okay, so having done that so far, I'm going to go and add a little bit more blue. Just a corner of yellow. So I've got a few highlights within that reflected light that's coming up off of the grass. And then we'll take that colour, put a few touches in there as well. Let's go a little greener. So we'll take a bit more yellow, a bit more blue. I think that will do for now for that particular colour, so I'm just cleaning my brush off. Cleaned it fairly well, haven't been too thorough, because it's not going to matter too much for what I mix up next. So some of the yellow, touch of the red, touch of the blue, a bit more red. Let's see what that looks like when we put it down on the painting. So I've got quite a dark shadow here under the chin of the animal. I want to soften the lower edge of that. That's not too bad, actually. Take some of that shadow. Around there. So yes, I'm fairly happy with that colour at the moment. Now some of that same colour I can put in down here. And on the chest. And that same colour I can just add a little bit to this little lamb to bring him out of the deep shadow a bit more than currently is. So at the moment I'm fairly content with that. I'm just looking to see if I can perhaps... No, I think I'm going to leave that there. We'll take that same colour that's still on the brush and mix some white in. Let's get a bit more of the brown. And let's see what this paler version of the same colour looks like when we put it down. Not too bad. I think I'm going to use some of that under the jawline there. I think that's working reasonably well from my point of view. I think that's starting to bring this lead animal to life. Now, what I want to do is just add a little bit more yellow to that mixture. And maybe even just the tiniest amount of the red. Oh, that hasn't changed the colour too much, actually. But let's put some of that down there. Just strengthen up the cheek a bit. Probably could do with some of that same colour up there as well. And then we'll actually just scumble a bit of that over here. So that's working reasonably well so far. Next step then is to just put in a few darker darks without going too strong. So one of the ways I enjoy doing this is just going back to how I kind of start out with my pure ultramarine blue. So the underside of that jaw, oh, that's way too wet. What I did there was I washed my brush out and then forgot that I was not working in thin layers at the moment. So let's just try the painting there. And also I'm just drying my brush. So let's try that again. So now using the ultramarine blue as it is straight out of the tube, we'll come back in and attempt to... Don't know how well that's going to show up on camera because it's quite shiny at the moment, the ultramarine blue. So in this light, you may not be able to see exactly how that's looking until it dries back. Yes, that's not too bad. I'm not going to go too wild here, but I'm just going to put a couple of little touches of that same colour. So for example, where I've got a natural kind of triangle of fleece, I can just put a little touch of that blue shadow underneath a mark that's already there. That's probably enough of that, I think. So now the next thing to do is I just want to make this a little paler. So I'm going to mix that in with the kind of off green I had before, but put a touch of the burnt umber in as well. That's quite a nice shadow colour for the front of the nose. So I'm just going to switch to a different brush. So I've switched to this brush, which has a very fine tip, and I'm going to take some of the ultramarine blue and some of the burnt umber and mix those two together to give me a nice dark. And we'll darken the nostril there. And then I want to be able to just going to reload the brush. Put a line in under there, under that part of the mouth. A line in for where the lips meet. Just define that lower jaw a little bit more. And then let's see if I get the camera a little bit closer for you. So now I'm going to use that same colour to just give me an outline for the eye, which I'm not sure I've placed in exactly the right spot there. Just look at that again. So what I'm doing at the moment is I'm just looking back and forth between my reference and my painting. And just trying to double check my proportions of this head. It's not too far out, but I think what I need to do is we'll go back to the little brush that I had before, clean that out, and I'll put the colour of the eye in first. So as you can see, I'm mixing up the cad yellow and a bit of the red to give me a fairly deep orange. Now I don't want it to be bright orange, so I'm going to pick up some of that brown I mixed up earlier. So I think this eye needs to come down here a little bit. Yeah, that's a bit better. Okay, good. Now, while that little application of paint is still wet, what I'm going to do is go back to that very pointed brush, which I'm just cleaning out at the moment, and dipping that into the straight out of the tube titanium white. So hopefully you can see I've just got the tiniest amount of white paint on the brush, and I'm just going to put, oh no, that's the brush is far too wet. So sorry, just drip water onto the painting. Let's try that again. So just drying the brush out. Let's wash it again first. So drying the brush out, squeezing out all the water, and we will try again. So again, I've just got the tiniest amount of white paint on there. Just put like a little highlight in there, nothing very much. And then that same bit of white paint, let's get a bit more. Going to pick up some of that orange I mixed up earlier, but create a lighter version of that same color. And then below that highlight that I just put in, just going to put a more or less horizontal line of that lighter color I just mixed up. So within the eye, we've got two different types of highlight. So now, just cleaned and dried off the super pointy brush again. So I'm going to come back in with my ultramarine blue, mixed in with a bit of the burnt umber. And if I can get a good point on the brush, put in the pupil of the eye, so that's worked reasonably well. Define the upper edge of the eye. Now I wouldn't normally outline an eye as I'm doing here in quite this way. I wouldn't normally use all one colour, but because it's all kind of lost in the dark colouring of the sheep's head in this region, I feel it's okay to, I can get away with it basically. So while I've got that on the brush, I'm just going to add a little more dark patterning to the head. So just cleaning the brush out a little bit, going back to the ultramarine blue. So some of the line of the head has got lost a little bit when I've painted, so I just want to very gently redefine that. So again, just looking fairly carefully at my reference. So the nose kind of comes up a little higher than it appears at the moment. So that's a bit better. Okay, that's brought things back in line. So switching back to the little flat square brush, I'm now going to come in again with my titanium white and a bit of the blue, and we'll just tidy up the shape of the head there. Put some of that there to show where the ear is a bit more clearly. Now I've got kind of a second line of the ear there, almost like an earlier iteration of where the ear should be. I'm happy to leave that. I don't mind that in my finished work. A little bit of an indication that how you got from one place to another in terms of the preparation or the steps towards the finished painting, but also it just adds a little bit of life, I think, to the work. Now, just looking at this, just trying to move my camera a little bit for you. Looking at this other animal over on the left, and I don't want to add too much detail, because if you have watched previous episodes or previous stages of this this painting, you'll know that the whole idea, as I mentioned earlier, is to leave this one less defined than this, and then these on the right, which are sort of almost off camera now, they're very poorly defined, deliberately so, and then the ones in the background are barely there. But I'm just wondering if I can, or should I, add a few touches here and there. So I think what I'll do is I'm going to come in with, well, we won't add any more detail, but I think I can add a little bit more of a sense of light on this animal and also just refine the form a bit in doing that. So I'm going to put a bit of a highlight there and there. So this is more or less pure white at the moment. And then I'm going to take that and mix it in with some of the ultramarine blue. Go back to my ultramarine blue, mix that in with a bit of the burnt umber. Give the animal a nostril. Darken the face a little bit. Just add a little bit more defining shadow there. I think that's working fairly well, because the outline of the animal is kind of disappearing a little bit too much into the background. So I don't want to do, I don't want to go crazy, but just perhaps bring it to life a little bit more than I had. And then, having put that line work down, come back in with my pure titanium white and then just break it up again just a bit. so that those marks aren't too heavy. But there's enough of a shadow there to add a little bit of definition. Oh, maybe I've gone, I don't know, maybe I've gone too dark there now. So just mixing in a touch of blue again with that white to just lighten that. And then I think that one's almost done, that animal. What I do want to do is, perhaps I have made the face a little bit too dark now. Well, let's find out. So what I'm going to do is just grab some of that orange that I mixed up before, add a touch of the burnt umber to it, so that it's a darker version of the eye colour I used before. And I have no intention of putting all the eye in, but or at least not at the moment, but just show that the animal does have an eye. And come back in, mix that colour in with the blue, bit of the burnt umber perhaps. That's perhaps a better way to go. Put a bit of shadow down here. Okay, so I don't think things are looking too bad. Let's just pull back a little bit with the camera. So I think I've managed to do what I wanted to do. I've brought a sense of life to that main animal in particular. And then the lamb here is still hidden in shadow, but without being dark in a sinister way, which is what it was a few episodes ago. This one's defined a little better. Just wondering if I should extend its back end a little more. I think I might actually. The body could do with being a little bit longer, perhaps. Yeah, let's just do that. But again, we'll keep it fairly loose. And then but before I do that, actually, what I'll do is I just want to add nothing very much. So I've got a very frayed 1/2-inch flat brush here, which I'm just dipping the tips into my titanium white. So I just want to add a few white highlights onto the grass in the foreground. And that's probably enough of that. So let's go back in with a bit of blue. So I've got a bit of an off-white, touch of the brown. Way too much. Let's see what that looks like if we put that down. Oh, I quite like that colour. Yeah, I think that works a bit better without being overly fussy about the description of that animal. All right, so I may end up doing a few finishing touches, but I think I'm pretty much done. Although, the only part of the painting I'm wondering about really are these background characters here, whether I should just define them a bit better than I have, with perhaps very pale paint to remove some of the line work. So let's give that how can I put it? I'm not trying to define them, but just give them more of a sense of form. So let's get a bit of the tinting titanium white, touch of burnt umber. So keep things neutral, a little bit of the blue, neutral and cool. Not different enough in tone, so grabbing a bit more of the white. And then just a touch of the burnt umber to that same mix. So hopefully just enough to sort of indicate that those, I think that works rather better. Definitely not describe those two animals, but better than they were. And that's intentional to leave that barely described. But I think they look more like barely described sheep than barely described random blobs of paint, which is perhaps what they were looking like before. Okay.